Chapter 12, sections 3 and 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. Recording by Kalinda. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 12, section 3 to 4. Section 3. Germanicus in the East. His death and the trial of Piso. In the East several affairs demanded the attention of the government, but not so imperatively as to require an extraordinary command like that which Tiberius assigned to Germanicus after his triumph. The dependent principalities of Cappadocia, Commagene, and Cilicia Aspera had to be transformed into provinces, for Archelaus of Cappadocia had been recalled to Rome, and informed that he had ceased to reign, while the peoples of Commagene and Cilicia had, on the death of their princes, begged for a direct Roman government. The inhabitants of Judea and Syria were murmuring loudly at the heavy taxation, and demanding a reduction. New difficulties had also arisen with the Parthian kingdom. Vonones, son of Phraates IV., who had been kept by Augustus as a hostage and brought up at Rome, was elected to the throne by the Parthians after the death of their king. He did not, however, reign long. His Roman manners gave offence, and he was forced to surrender his throne to Artabanus of Media, and fly to Seleucia. The Armenian throne was at this moment vacant, and the people accepted the fugitive Vonones as their sovran, but Artabanus, who could not endure the rule of his rival in a neighbouring kingdom, called upon them to surrender him. Meanwhile Silanus, legatus of Syria, got possession of the person of Vonones, and detained him in Syria. All these affairs might have been arranged by ordinary imperial legati, but Tiberius may have had a good reason for sending a near kinsman and a Caesar, invested with special powers and representing the imperial majesty, to deal with the eastern countries, where pomp always produces its effect. Such a plan had been successful before, when Gaius Caesar received a like mission from Augustus. The sphere of the command of Germanicus was all the provinces beyond the Hellespont. He travelled thither at leisurely speed, visiting Nicopolis, Athens, and Lesbos on his way, and lingering in the cities of the Hellespont. The affairs of Armenia he arranged without difficulty, and established friendly relations with the Parthian king. The favour of the Armenians inclined to Zeno, son of Polemo, former king of Pontus, who had been brought up as an Armenian from his infancy, and was popular by his excellence as a huntsman and a trencherman. Germanicus visited the city of Artaxaea, and solemnly crowned Zeno there under the royal name of Artaxes. This arrangement also satisfied Artabanus, who regarded Vonones as the Roman candidate, and had put forward his own son Orodes as the Parthian candidate. The election of Artaxes was a satisfactory compromise, and Artabanus sent a courteous message to the Roman general, proposing a personal meeting on the Euphrates, and only requiring him to remove Vonones from Syria, so as to prevent communications with the disaffected party in Persia. Germanicus readily acceded to the request, and Vonones was removed to Pompeiiopolis in Cilicia. Thus excellent relations were established between the Roman and the Parthian powers, and continued to exist during the lifetime of Artaxes, until the last years of the reign of Tiberius. Cappadocia and Commagene were at the same time incorporated in the provincial system, and thus the direct rule of Rome extended now to the Euphrates. Germanicus had speedily and satisfactorily accomplished the main object of his mission, but he had other difficulties to contend with. It was not the intention of Tiberius that the ample authority of the young Caesar should be as completely unchecked in the east as it had been in the north. Consequently Silanus, who was a personal friend of Germanicus, was replaced as proconsul of Syria by C. Calpurnius Piso, a proud, self-asserting nobleman, who would not hesitate to hold his own against his superior. The position of Piso was strengthened, and his independent spirit encouraged by the bonds of intimacy which existed between his wife Plancina and the Emperor's mother Livia. The dissensions of Piso and Germanicus were doubtless embittered by the rivalry of Plancina and Agrippina. Piso had been instructed to lead or send a portion of the Syrian army to join Germanicus in Armenia. He disobeyed this command, and the ill feeling between the Caesar and the legatus became very bitter. It is not clear why Germanicus did not invoke the intervention of the Emperor, but instead of asserting his authority in Syria he made an excursion to Egypt, not for any political purpose, but from a curiosity to visit the antiquities of the land. This expedition was imprudent in two ways, for it left the field clear to Piso, and it violated the law of Augustus, that no senator should set foot on Egyptian soil without the express permission of the Emperor. On returning to Syria, Germanicus found that Piso had disregarded and overthrown his own regulations. This discovery roused him into asserting his authority, and Piso prepared to leave the province. Suddenly Germanicus fell ill at Antioch, and Piso postponed his departure. The attendants of Germanicus suspected and circulated their suspicions, that poison had been administered to him by Piso or his wife. Messages inquiring after the health of the prince arrived from Piso, who was lingering at Seleucia; but Germanicus, distrustful of their genuineness, wrote a letter to the governor, renouncing his friendship, and commanding him, perhaps, to leave the province. Piso sailed to Cos, and there received the news of his rival's death (19 A.D.). Germanicus himself believed that he was the victim of foul play, for on his deathbed he charged his friends to prosecute Piso and Plancina, and his friends determined that he should be avenged. Agrippina, with her children and the ashes of her husband, immediately set sail for Rome. The staff of the dead prince chose C. Sentius Saturninus to take charge of Syria until a new governor should be appointed. Piso, however, determined to make a bold attempt to resume his command in that province, and for this purpose collected some troops in Cilicia. But Sentius was victorious in an engagement, and besieged Piso in the Cilician fortress of Celenderis. The ex governor was finally forced to submit, and take ship for Rome, where an unpleasant reception awaited him. The feelings of sympathy awakened by the death of Germanicus were intense, both in the provinces and at Rome. Triumphal arches were erected in his honour, and his statues were set up in cities. Inscriptions recorded that he had died for the Republic. Correspondingly bitter was the rage felt against Piso and Plancina, who were generally believed to have been guilty. Nor were there wanting hints and murmurs that Tiberius himself and Livia were privy to the supposed crime of Piso and Plancina. It was thought that Tiberius regarded his nephew with jealousy and hatred, and rejoiced at his death, and it was apparently this idea that encouraged Piso to act as he had done. The reserve of Tiberius in regard to the funeral ceremonies of Germanicus, at which he and Livia were not present, was interpreted in the same way, and the Emperor even went so far as to show displeasure at the excess of the public lamentations. He issued a characteristic edict, enjoining on the people to observe some moderation in their sorrow. "Princes are mortal, the Republic is eternal. Resume your business, resume your pleasures," he added, for the Megalesian games approached. By this contempt for popular sentiment, Tiberius, it has been remarked, was sowing the seeds of a long and deep misunderstanding between himself and his people. Men contrasted the behaviour of Augustus on the death of Drusus. But the Emperor had no intention of protecting Piso, who had been guilty of the serious offence of trying to recover a province from which he had been dismissed by a superior in authority. The friends of Germanicus vied in undertaking the prosecution, but it was hard to find advocates to plead the cause of Piso. His friends wished the accused to come before the tribunal of the Emperor, but Tiberius did not like to undertake the decision of such a delicate case, and he referred the judgment of it to the senate. He opened the proceedings in the senate house in a very impartial speech. The charges of political misconduct were clearly proven, but the charge of having made attempts on the life of Germanicus by magic and poison broke down. The senators, however, who in general sympathised with Germanicus, felt convinced that the prince's death had been due to foul play, while the political offences of the culprit weighed with Tiberius. At the close of the second day of the trial, Piso saw in the cold look of the Emperor that his doom was fixed. His conclusion was confirmed by the behaviour of his wife Plancina, who had pleaded for him with the Empress Livia, but, as his chance of escape seemed to grow less, tried to sever her own cause from his. He anticipated the sentence by piercing his throat with his sword. The senate expunged his name from the Fasti and banished his eldest son for 10 years, but Tiberius interfered to mitigate the sentence of the senate, and conceded Piso's property to his son. The influence of Livia shielded Plancina from prosecution. Thus ended a domestic tragedy. It must be observed that even if it were certain that Germanicus was the victim of foul play, there was not the smallest reason to suspect that the Emperor was in any way concerned, as malicious rumours hinted. But there is no proof, and there can be no certainty, that the death of Germanicus was brought about by unfair practices of Piso or his wife. Another malicious report which gained belief was that Piso had not died by his own hand, but had been assassinated by the orders of the Emperor. The qualities of Germanicus have been painted in such bright colours by the great Roman historian who has recorded his career, that we cannot help feeling deeply prepossessed in his favour. He appears as one of the ideal heroes who die young. But it is not clear that he would have become a great man if he had lived. His exploits have been exaggerated by the enthusiasm of his admirers. Tacitus, with more regard to art than truth, has selected him as the brilliant hero to set beside the dark figure of Tiberius. Germanicus is generous and virtuous, Tiberius suspicious and stained with crime. The uncle is the ideal tyrant, the nephew is the magnanimous prince. This picture of Tacitus in some measure reflects the general feeling which seems to have prevailed on the death of the popular Germanicus. Tiberius was misunderstood and maligned; the virtues of the son of Drusus were exaggerated. In the year 16 A.D. a plot was detected, which, though not of a formidable nature, attracted considerable attention. It shows that there was dissatisfaction in patrician circles, and illustrates the character of Tiberius. A young man, named Libo Drusus, of the Scribonian family, was accused of revolutionary projects. Scribonia, the second wife of Augustus, was his great aunt, Livia was his aunt, and he was the grandson of Sextus Pompeius through his mother. These connections with the imperial house seem to have turned his brain and suggested perilous ideas, which were encouraged by a senator named Firmius Catus, who was his intimate friend. Catus induced him to consult Chaldaean astrologers and dabble in magic rites, practices which were then very dangerous, as they were regarded as a presumption of treasonable designs. He also treacherously led Drusus into extravagance and debt. Having collected sufficient proofs of guilt, Catus sent a messenger to the Emperor, craving an audience and mentioning the name of the accused. Tiberius refused the request, saying that any further communications might be conveyed to him in the same way. Meanwhile he distinguished his cousin Libo by conferring the praetorship on him, and often inviting him to table, showing no unfriendliness either in word or look, but he kept himself carefully informed of the daily conduct of the suspected man. At length a certain Junius, whom Libo had tampered with for the purpose of invoking the dead by incantations, gave information to a noted informer, Fulcinius Trio, who immediately went to the consuls and demanded an investigation before the senate. Libo meanwhile knowing his peril, arrayed himself in mourning, and, accompanied by some ladies of high rank, went round the houses of his relatives entreating their intervention. But all refused on various pretexts. When the senate met, Tiberius read out the indictment and the accusers' names with such calmness as to seem neither to soften nor to aggravate the charges. Some of them were of a ridiculous nature. For example, he was accused of having considered whether he would ever have wealth enough to cover the Appian road as far as Brundusium with money. But there was one paper in which the names of Caesars and senators occurred with mysterious, and therefore suspicious, signs annexed. Libo denied the handwriting, and the slaves who professed to recognize it were examined by torture. As an old decree of the senate forbade the evidence of slaves to be taken in cases affecting their master's life, Tiberius evaded the law by ordering the slaves to be sold singly to the actor publicus, or agent of the aerarium, so that Libo might be tried on their testimony. The accused begged for an adjournment till the following day. On going home he committed suicide, seeing that his case was hopeless. Tiberius said that he would have interceded for him, guilty though he was, if he had not destroyed himself. Libo's property was divided among the accusers, and some of the senators proposed decrees reflecting on his memory, for example, that no Scribonian should bear the name of Drusus, in order to please Tiberius. Days of public thanksgiving were appointed, and it was decreed that the day on which Libo killed himself should be observed as a festival. Such sycophancy on the part of the senate became in later times a matter of course. SECT. 4. Rebellions in the provinces and dependencies. We must glance at the troublesome, though unimportant war, which was waged at this time on the southern borders of the Empire, and at the career of Tacfarinas, who played in Africa the same part which the more famous Arminius played in the north. This Numidian had served in the Roman army, and had thus gained a knowledge of Roman discipline and military science. He then deserted, placed himself at the head of a band of robbers, and was finally elected as their leader by the Musulamni, who dwelt on the southern side of Mount Aurasius. The insurrection was not confined to these peoples of Numidia. It spread westward into Mauretania and eastward to the Garamantes. The discipline and drill which Tacfarinas enforced rendered the rising formidable, for his organised bands were able to give battle and attempt sieges. The commanders, whom the senate elected by lot, were incompetent to deal with the insurgents, and the resulting war was protracted for 7 years (17 to 24 A.D.). The single legion which protected Africa was reinforced by a second from Pannonia, and by the Emperor's intervention an able proconsul, Q. Junius Blsesus, was at length appointed. Tacfarinas had demanded from Tiberius a grant of territory for himself and his rebel army. Tiberius haughtily refused, and instructed Blsesus to hold out to other chiefs who supported Tacfarinas the prospect of a free pardon if they laid down their arms. Many surrendered, and then Blsesus attempted to meet Tacfarinas by tactics similar to his own. He divided his army into 3 columns, one of which he dispatched eastward under Cornelius Scipio to act against the Garamantes and protect Leptis. In the west the son of Blsesus commanded a second column and defended the territory of Cirta, while in the centre Blsesus himself established a number of fortified positions, and thus embarrassed the enemy, who found, wherever he turned, Roman soldiers in his face, or on his flank, or in his rear. When summer was over, Blsesus continued hostilities, and by a skilful combination of forts and flying detachments of picked men, who were acquainted with the desert, he drove Tacfarinas back step by step, and finally captured his brother and occupied the district of the Musulamni (22 A.D.). Tiberius permitted the triumphal ornaments to be awarded to Blsesus, and also granted him the distinction of being greeted Imperator by the troops, the last occasion on which this honour was granted to a private person. But even the success of Blsesus was not the end of the insurrection. There were 3 laurelled statues at Rome for victories over the Musulamian chief, those of Camillus, Apronius, and Blsesus, and yet he was still ravaging Africa, supported on the one hand by the king of the Garamantes, on the other by the Moors. His boldness was increased by the circumstance that, after the campaign of Blsesus, the IXth legion had been recalled from Africa. In 24 A.D. he laid siege to Thubursicum, a Numidian town lying a little to the north of Mount Aurasius. The proconsul of the year, Publius Dolabella, immediately collected all his troops and raised the siege. Knowing by the experience of previous campaigns that it was useless to concentrate his heavy troops against an enemy which practised such desultory warfare as Tacfarinas, Dolabella adopted the plan of Blsesus, and divided his forces into 4 columns. He also obtained reinforcements from Ptolemy, king of the Mauretanians. Presently he was informed that the Numidian marauders had taken up a position close to Osea (Aumale), a dilapidated fort, surrounded by vast forests. Some light armed infantry and squadrons of horse were immediately hurried to the place, without being told whither they were going. At daybreak they fell upon the drowsy barbarians, who had no means of flight, as their horses were tethered or pasturing at a distance. The dispositions of the Romans were so complete that the enemies were slaughtered or captured without difficulty. The general was anxious to capture Tacfarinas, but that chieftain, driven to bay, escaped captivity by rushing on the weapons of his assailants. His death ended this tedious war. During this period there were also grave disturbances in Gaul and Thrace. In Gaul the fiscal exactions had led to heavy accumulations of debt among the provincials, and the creditors pressed for payment. The provincials resorted to counsels of despair. A conspiracy was formed to organize a rebellion throughout the whole land, and throw off the Roman yoke. The leaders were Julius Florus and Julius Sacrovir, 2 Romanised provincials. Florus undertook to gain over the Belgae and Treveri, while Sacrovir, who perhaps held some priestly office, intrigued among the Aedui and other tribes. The secret was well kept, and the revolt broke out in western Gaul in the consulship of Tiberius and Drusus (21 A.D.). But the first rising was premature. The Andecavi and the Turones, whose names still live in Anjou and Tours, moved too soon, and were crushed by the garrison of Lugudunum, under Acilius Aviola, the legatus of Lugudunensis. This false move put the Romans on their guard, and the subsequent risings of the Treveri were easily foiled by the governors of the 2 Germanic provinces. Florus slew himself to escape capture. The Aedui had seized the important city of Augustodunum (Autun), but they too were easily defeated by C. Silius, legatus of Upper Germany, at the 12th milestone from that town. Sacrovir escaped from the field to a neighbouring villa, where he fell by his own hand, and his faithful comrades slew one another, having first set fire to the house. A triumphal arch was erected at Orassio (Orange) to commemorate the defeat of Sacrovir. The dependent kingdom of Thrace, after the death of Rhcemetalces, who had loyally stood by the Romans in the Dalmatian revolt, was divided between his brother Rhascuporus and his son Cotys. Their jealousies and feuds, which ended in the murder of Cotys, led to Roman interference and the execution of his uncle (19 A.D.). 2 years later a formidable insurrection of the western tribes broke out. The rebels besieged Philippopolis, but were defeated by P. Velleius, the governor of Moesia. They rebelled again in 25 A.D., and of this rising we have more details. The mountaineers refused to submit to levies and to supply their bravest men to the armies of Rome. A rumour had spread that they were to be dragged from their own land to distant provinces, so that, mixed with other nations, they might lose their own nationality. They sent envoys to the governor of Achaia and Macedonia, Papaeus Sabinus, assuring him of their fidelity, if no fresh burden were laid upon them. Otherwise they gave him to understand that they would fight for their freedom. He gave mild answers until he had completed his preparations, but when he had concentrated his forces and was joined by a legion from Moesia and reinforcements from Rhcemetalces, son of Rhascuporus, he advanced on the rebels, who had taken up a position in some wooded defiles in the mountains, in the neighbourhood of a strong fortress. Sabinus fortified a camp and occupied with a strong detachment a long narrow mountain ridge which stretched as far as the enemy's fortress, which it was his object to capture. After some skirmishing in front of the stronghold, Sabinus moved his camp nearer, but left his Thracian allies in the former entrenchments, with strict injunctions to pass the night vigilantly within the camp, while they might harry and plunder as much as they wished in the daytime. Having observed this command for some time, they began to neglect their watches, and gave themselves up to the enjoyment of wine and sleep. Learning this, the insurgents formed two bands, of which one was to surprise the pillagers, the other to attack the Roman camp, in order to distract the attention of the soldiers. The plan was successful, and the Thracian auxiliaries were massacred. Sabinus then laid regular siege to the stronghold, and connected his positions with a ditch and a rampart. The besieged suffered terribly from thirst, and their cattle were dying for want of fodder. The air of the place was polluted with the stench of the rotting carcasses of those who had perished by wounds or thirst. In this situation many followed the advice and example of an old man named Dimmus, who surrendered himself, with his wife and children, to the Romans. But two young chieftains, named Tarsa and Turissus, had determined to die for their freedom. Tarsa plunged his sword in his heart, and a few others did likewise. But Turissus and his followers decided to prolong the struggle, and planned a night attack on the camp during a storm. Sabinus was prepared, and the brave barbarians were beaten back and compelled to surrender. The triumphal ornaments were decreed to Sabinus (26 A.D.). Against a revolt of tributaries on the northern boundary of the Empire, the arms of Rome were not so successful. The Frisians, who had been subdued by Drusus in 12 B.C., had for 40 years paid the tribute which he imposed on them. This tribute consisted in ox hides, which were required for military purposes, and officers who levied it never examined too curiously the size or thickness of the skins, until in 28 A.D. Olennius, a primipillar centurion, who was appointed to exact the tribute, chose the hides of wild bulls as the standard. As the domestic cattle of the Germans were of small size, the Frisians found this innovation hard. In order to meet the demands of Olennius, they were forced to give up first their cattle, then their lands, finally to surrender their wives and children as pledges. As their complaints led to no redress, they rose in revolt. The soldiers who were collecting the tribute were impaled on gibbets, and Olennius himself was obliged to flee to the fortress of Flavum, probably in the island of the same name, now Vlieland, near the Texel, which was a Roman coastguard station. When the news reached L. Apronius, the governor of Lower Germany, he summoned some veteran legionaries, and chose auxiliaries from the upper province to reinforce his own legions, with which he sailed down the Rhine and relieved Flavum, which the Frisians were besieging. He then constructed roads and bridges over the adjoining estuaries, in order to transport his legionaries into the heart of the Frisian territory, and in the meantime sent some auxiliary cavalry and infantry across by a ford to take the enemy in the rear. The Frisians beat these forces back; more cohorts and squadrons were sent to the rescue, but these too were repulsed, and soon all the auxiliary forces were engaged. The legions were at length able to intervene, and just saved the cohorts and cavalry, who were completely exhausted. A large number of officers had fallen, but Apronius did not attempt to take vengeance, or even to bury the dead. Two other disasters completed the ill luck of the Romans. 900 soldiers were destroyed by the enemy in the wood of Baduhenna, and another body of 400, who had taken possession of a country house, perished by mutual slaughter, to avoid falling into the hands of the enemy. No further steps seem to have been taken against the Frisians. These events probably confirmed Tiberius in his determination to regard the Rhine as the limit of the Roman Empire, and he thought it a good opportunity to abandon the last relic of the conquests of his brother beyond that river. The reign of Tiberius was very nearly being marked by a slave war in southern Italy, but by a lucky accident the movement was crushed in its very beginning (24 A.D.). The organizer of the rebellion was Titus Curtisius, who had once been a praetorian soldier. He held secret meetings at Brundusium and other towns in the neighbourhood, then posted up placards, and incited the slave population in Calabria and Apulia to assert their liberty. 3 vessels happened to come to land just then, and from them the quaestor Curtius Lupus, who had charge of the saltus, or forests and pastures in those parts, obtained a force of marines and crushed the conspiracy. Curtisius and his chief accomplices were sent prisoners to Rome, where, says Tacitus, men already felt alarm at the enormous number of the slave population, which was ever increasing, while the freeborn population grew less every day. The great marvel is that combinations among the slaves were not more common, and that it was not thought necessary to keep considerable garrisons in the towns of Italy to meet such emergencies. End of Chapter 12, Section 4. Recording by Kalinda in Lüneburg, Germany, on March 21st, 2009.